Now we have to tend to the urea cycle. So we got the nitrogen moved out of the cells. We've got our amino acids stripped down to their carbon backbones. And that was our objective, to make sure that we can take all those carbons and put them into the energy producing cycles. Now what we need to do is finish the story about the nitrogen. So we have our nitrogens being released from our glutamine by glutaminase, nitrogen being released by glutamate dehydrogenase, and these are in that form of that ammonium ion. So the ammonium ion is going to be trapped very quickly by CPS1, carbamoyl phosphate synthetase 1, to make carbamoyl phosphate. And again, this is now safe. We'll look at what happens to this ammonia if we don't trap this in a little bit. Now, the end product of this whole cycle is this molecule here. Everybody got that?
Urea.
Urea, good. What gave it away?
Nitrogen.
The big urea on the left. Yeah.
The big word on the left? Yeah, there you go. Okay, good. So we're going to make urea. And urea is completely, absolutely, 100% safe and worthless. It's worthless to us as an energy source because we have this structure that we have no enzymes that can do anything with this. So ultimately, what we need to do is excrete this. So now how do we go from carbamoyl phosphate with this one nitrogen on it to this structure? This is the urea cycle. So what are we going to do? We're going to take this molecule and we are going to add ornithine. And ornithine, we are going to make citrulline. Okay, so what are these molecules? These are simply carrier molecules in the urea cycle that is going to take the carbamoyl phosphate structure and piggyback it along around the cycle. The enzyme that does this ornithine combination with this, is ornithine transcarbamylase. Now this is a really, really important enzyme that you got to know. I'm not joking, because there's a huge medical problem right at this juncture. We'll talk about that in a second. So now, once we have citrulline, and again, ornithine is a simple amino acid. It's not one that we use for proteins, but it's just a simple amino acid. And all it's going to do again is carry the carbamoyl phosphate group. So once we put this together, we make citrulline. Then citrulline is going to exit the mitochondria. So these reactions, these initial reactions, are occurring in the mitochondrial matrix because that's where our nitrogen is. So we're adding our first nitrogen to make our 2-nitrogen urea compound in the matrix of the mitochondria. Then we take our citrulline in the cytoplasm, and we are going to add to this aspartic acid. So here's our aspartate. And remember, this came from our conversion of, glutamine to pyruvate. So the conversion of alanine to pyruvate that we saw is going to create oxaloacetate to aspartic acid. And the alanine, of course, is coming from muscle. So this is what we just saw. Muscle makes alanine, sends it out to the liver, liver takes it up, makes pyruvate. The nitrogens, by this transamination reaction, go on to oxaloacetate to make aspartate. The pyruvate then in the liver goes on to gluconeogenesis. So here's that aspartic acid that I said, let's put on the side for now. And what the aspartic acid is going to add is the second nitrogen of urea. And what we're forming here is argininosuccinate. So again, all this structure is an amino acid-like molecule that is carrying the nitrogen as it's being processed around the cycle. So the first nitrogen comes from our carbamoyl phosphate, from our ammonia release assays, reactions. And then the second nitrogen is coming from our aspartic acid. So now, what these two reactions do is it accounts for all of the nitrogens that are coming into the liver. We've got the nitrogen coming in from glutamine, we've got the nitrogen coming in from alanine, and now we have a net zero gain of nitrogen in the liver because we've got them both connected onto this molecule called argininosuccinate. This enzyme that does this is called argininosuccinate synthetase. Now, the next step of this reaction, the aspartate is carrying the nitrogen for this reaction, but it's also carrying a carbon backbone, and that carbon backbone is oxaloacetate. So what we need to do is be able to recover the carbons from the aspartate and leave the nitrogen behind. The reason we need to do that is because we're going to have continued amounts of alanine coming in from muscle, and we have to continue this reaction of oxaloacetate to aspartate to keep the flow of nitrogens going into the urea cycle. So in this reaction, next reaction, this is going to be converted into the actual amino acid arginine. What's coming off of this, the nitrogen is staying on the structure. So the arginine is still going to have the two nitrogens, but what we're removing is the 4 carbons that was donated down here. So oxaloacetate has 4 carbons, aspartate has 4 carbons, plus that nitrogen, plus the 1 nitrogen. We're adding that nitrogen into the urea cycle, but we have to recover these 4 carbons in order to keep this reaction going. Now remember, fumarate is part of the TCA cycle. So what we can do here is we can convert this to malate. That's that normal fumarase reaction. And then the malate can be converted by the malate dehydrogenase back to oxaloacetate so that we can keep the flow of nitrogen coming into the urea cycle. Good so far? So the enzyme that does this is argininosuccinate lyase. Now, once we get to arginine, we're ready to generate our urea. And the way we're going to generate this is that we are going to release that portion of the molecule on arginine that is carrying those 2 nitrogens. And that is this structure right here, urea. So urea is released at this point by the enzyme arginase. And look what we have generated, ornithine. So we're back to the beginning. Now we have to get the ornithine into the matrix of the mitochondria so that we can keep processing the carbamoyl phosphate. And so this transporter that transports citrulline out will transport ornithine in. So that is a 1-to-1 antiporter. And so for every citrulline coming out, 1 ornithine goes in and our equation is balanced. Now, what's medically the most relevant thing about this? Urea cycle disorders. Again, these are inborn errors of metabolism. So the most represented error, mutation in the urea cycle is right here. Ornithine transcarbamylase. A reduction, a mutation that reduces the amount of this enzyme or eliminates this enzyme is going to prevent the reaction of ornithine and carbamoyl phosphate. So now, you can pretty much predict what's going to happen here, because remember in biochemistry when you've got a pathway, if you block something, you're going to cause substrates to build up. And you need an escape route. So like we saw with regulating cholesterol synthesis, if you block HMG-CoA reductase, all of that HMG-CoA can reverse into acetyl-CoA and it can enter the fatty acid synthesis pathway. That's the escape route. Here, if we block this enzyme, we block the conversion of ornithine with carbamoyl phosphate. Carbamoyl phosphate levels start going up. That will inhibit this reaction here. What's the consequence of inhibiting this reaction, CPS1? Death. I'm going to get a bad reputation in this block. Everything seems to lead to death, right? It's modern medicine. So it's going to lead to an increase in ammonium ion. Now, ammonium ion is toxic in all cases in the body, and so this will lead to hyperammonemia, high levels of ammonia in the body, in the circulation. The first thing that you would see from this, if you did a blood test, would be, what would the pH in the blood be? Basic, yeah. So this is going to lead to alkalosis. So the pH is going to go up. So just the opposite of our metabolic acidosis. Hyperammonemia can lead to coma real quick. And the way it does that is now I'm stepping into very dangerous territories because this is going above the neck, and I usually try to leave that to Dr. Shuttleworth. So we have these neurons. You would love it the way I do neuro. I should do the neuro block. It's like, this is a neuron. This is a presynaptic neuron. Synaptic. Okay, so a presynaptic neuron is going to have neurotransmitters. Honest to God, this is the way I think of it at this level. So let's look at a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Excitatory, yeah. Good, thank you. So the job of the glutamate is to go across the synaptic cleft, bind to the postsynaptic neuron, and transmit information. So the question is where does the glutamate come from? The glutamate comes from glutamine in the presynaptic neuron. And the way we are doing this reaction is that we are using the enzyme glutaminase releasing ammonia in order to generate glutamate, and then this is our active neurotransmitter. Now let's go to another real fancy cell type. They're not round. The astrocyte. So the job of the astrocyte is to do this. It's to take this ammonium ion, add glutamate to make glutamine. This here is the glutamine synthetase enzyme. It does this reaction. Same reaction is occurring in the muscle. And then the glutamine is transported out for the neuron. And then the neuron takes this up and continues the cycle. Now, if we have high levels of this, because we have a mutation in our ornithine transcarbamylase enzyme, what's going to happen to this cycle? The cycle is going to increase. One particular product here is going to increase beyond its normal level. Glutamine, yeah. This is going to raise the concentration of glutamine because now we have ammonia coming in from an external source beside that's just generated by the neuron. So if the purpose is to supply glutamine and retrieve glutamate, if we increase the concentration of glutamine, what happens to our concentration of glutamate? Think about this reaction here. So increased amounts of this, ammonia, plus glutamate, driving this reaction forward to increase this product formed here. What's going to happen to this concentration? It's going to decrease. And so ultimately what's going to happen is we are going to deplete the neuron of the neurotransmitter glutamate. Now, is the urea cycle regulated? This is another really important feature. So if you have more protein coming in, more nitrogen coming into your liver, it seems like it'd be pretty rational for the liver to say, I need to turn up the rate of my urea cycle so that I don't send out ammonia to the body. So how can we turn this up? Well, the most logical point to regulate would be right here, is CPS1. Now, how is CPS1 regulated? Well, we're going to need some sort of feed-forward reaction. So let's take the amino acid arginine. Arginine is an amino acid in all proteins. And so if you have an excess of protein, that means you're going to have an excess of arginine, high levels of arginine. So arginine is going to be sensing the, sort of like the sampling amino acid. Arginine is going to activate the conversion of glutamate to N-acetyl glutamate. So arginine activates the enzyme that takes glutamate and acetyl-CoA and converts that into N-acetyl glutamate. So it's sampling the arginine concentration. Now, N-acetyl glutamate is an activator of CPS1. Now, there's another enzyme that we're going to talk about more tomorrow. And that's a little preview, is called CPS2. And this enzyme is involved in pyrimidine synthesis. So this is the connection between the urea cycle and nucleic acid formation. CPS2 is going to perform the same reaction with nitrogen ammonia. It's going to make carbamoyl phosphate, and that's going to increase your pyrimidine synthesis. CPS2 is not regulated. So the N-acetylglutamate will activate CPS1, but it will not influence CPS2. So what this means is that if you have a defect in carbamoyl phosphate, let's say you either have reduced activity, inborn error, you're going to have higher concentrations of ammonia that's going to lead to hyperammonemia. But let's say you have slightly decreased activity here. This ammonia will be pushed into another reaction. And that's by CPS2 in the cytoplasm. This will increase pyrimidine and also purine synthesis, because the carbamoyl phosphate that is going to be generated for this is a substrate for nucleotide synthesis. And so we're going to go over this a little bit more detail tomorrow. But the end result of this, with a urea defect, cycle defect, is an individual will also have problems with gout. This leads to increases in nucleotide activity, increasing the degradation rate. We'll look at this in detail tomorrow, leading to gout. So there's usually an accompanying symptom with a urea cycle defect of not only hyperammonemia, but also excessive uric acid production. And we'll look at that mechanism a little bit more tomorrow.